It is Thursday, February 6th at noon Pacific time. Welcome to the Indigenous Language Assessment for Early Childhood and Beyond. And we will begin the short webinar here in just a moment, and it will be recorded, and you can locate it at the NLCC website through which you went ahead and registered through. We are going to have the audio through the phone conference right now, and then also we have videos, and so we want you to make sure you understand that the video audio will only play through the computer speakers, not the phone line. So we ask that you mute the computer speakers during the presentation, and then when prompted, you can mute your phone speaker and unmute your computer speakers prior to the videos being played. And on each slide where we have the videos, we will say, please mute your phone line, please unmute your computer so you can hear the videos. And when each video has finished, and then you can mute your computer speakers and unmute your phone speakers if you want to do that. What I'm going to do next here is bring you up to date where we're at on the slide. So we're going to do a video test. I'm going to turn this over to Cree. So we're going to test to make sure you guys can actually hear. So please mute your phone speakers now and unmute your computer speakers.
So here is the test. So everybody should have their phone audio muted and their computer audio on. So if you can hear this, you don't need to type anything, but if you can't, you please say something. That way we know that if you can hear it or if you can't hear it. So hopefully everybody heard that and got a quick laugh out of that. So it's looking like people can hear it. I like to play that because there's a little bit of science behind that. When you laugh, your brain releases some endorphins and it gets your brain ready for learning. So I just I thought it would be good to start us off with a good laugh. So go ahead, Maria.
Okay. So yeah, that worked out pretty well. We'll have to remember to do that again. So back to the lobby, NLCC TTA Center. And our presenter today is Cree Washula, and she is our TTA director here. As you can see, Cree is an enrolled member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and she was raised on the Kaw Reservation, and she serves as an in-house expert on native language revitalization efforts, second language acquisition, and best teaching practices. And Cree is very well versed in language and how it works, as well as early childhood. So you can finish reading her biography here. I know she kind of gets a little embarrassed when I do it all the way through, so I'll stop here. So Cree, if you'd like to go ahead and start, I'll go ahead and mute myself and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Maria. I just wanted to start off with a quick prayer. I truly believe that language revitalization is a ceremony of healing, and so I like to remind myself what we're doing and what this work, getting our hearts and our minds lined up for the work that we're doing and for the information that I'm going to share with you all today. Kuplirski huiltet, me weekendum hinks choitet, kukulti buusta abnat ochot michasik choitet, kuchituchtux pachpachtet, milutxen lipmentum, kuchituchtux kuchquachtet, mini aib kuchtchet mis, hito yayat hito gas chest. All right, so the goals and objectives of this webinar is mainly to review where children are at in various ages and stages of their development. A 1-year-old child will look very different from a 3-year-old child, and looking at what a beginner to advanced child speaker might look like in their second language. And I also want to explore different assessment methodologies. And the reason that this is important is because it can get very hard as a teacher or as a language program trying to figure out, children are really important to transmit language to, but how do we know what we're doing is working? Because they're still trying to master their first language, and odds are their first language is English. And so how do we go about assessing second language proficiency if they're not able to perform at a fluent speaker level in their first language? And so another challenge that we might come across is that younger children cannot read or write typically. You do have some that go beyond, but usually you can't use paper tests from assessment methods with young children. So just exploring those different possibilities to assess where they are at. And so today we're mainly going to be going over comprehension, which is also known as receptive, and speech, also known as expressive. So there's 4 areas of language assessment, and we will not be discussing reading and writing today. That would be a whole nother webinar. All right, so I just kind of wanted to go over some basic language development. I thought that this was really interesting, that language development actually, they're starting to figure out it begins during pregnancy. And so in this example, they did a study of an English-speaking mother, and so they hooked up this biomagnetometer to the fetus and monitored the fetal heart rate. And so when the fetus was exposed on the outside to Japanese speech, they noticed that the heart rate changed. And then, but it didn't change when the fetus was exposed to the same language as their mother. And so they're saying now that that language starts to develop in the uterus, which I feel like is very useful for just people in language in general, that it is important to expose even a pregnant woman and her baby to it very early on. For the first 6 months, babies are born, they just get flooded with new brain cells. And so babies can hear all the different sounds in the world. They can babble in all the different sounds in all the languages in the world, which is about 6,000 phonemes, which one language typically has around 40 to 60. But as the child grows, they will start to prune their ability to hear those different sounds. And so around 6 months, between 6 months and 12 months, they'll start to show preference for what language they're exposed to, their native language or their both languages if they're multilingual or bilingual. And so they'll start to discard all the other sounds that they were able to hear at birth. And so that happens somewhere between 6 to 12 months that they start losing that ability. Not to say that you can't regain it after that, but that's where their brains will naturally start to focus on what languages they are exposed to. And so, I was ahead of myself. So this is the pruning. They prune those connections and they strengthen the language that they're in. Okay, so this I'm going to review. This comes directly from Teaching Strategies Gold. I was a Head Start teacher at one point in my life. So we use their they have a list of objectives, and those cover social, emotional, cognitive. This is what they had for language. And so I'm gonna go through. There's kind of 3 areas that I will review, and that is comprehension, speech, and conversation. And so we'll start with birth to 1 year. And even birth to 1 year is such a huge range. So the way that infants to 1 year old show comprehension is that they'll look at the speaker. They'll turn their head towards you if you say their name. If you wave at them and ask them to wave back, they will around 7 months. Blow kisses, play peekaboo. That's them demonstrating comprehension. And then speech, they'll babble, and they start, as they get older, they start babbling in sentence-like intonations. Any kind of vocalization or squealing, as real small infants, especially with the eye contact, that they're demonstrating that they're trying to communicate. And that will be counted as speech at that age. And then engages in conversation, shakes head for no, waves by, looking at the speaker again, and then watches for signs of being understood. So I have some examples here. So go ahead and your audio is probably already muted on your phone, but go ahead and unmute your computer audio, and I will show you the first video.
Ako manikam, baby. Sweet dick,
Okay, hopefully everybody heard that. Maria, did you hear that? At least I can get a confirmation from you.
Yes, I heard that.
Okay, thank you. So we're going back to the slides here. So just looking at that quick little video, we can identify some things in here. So engages in conversation in speech. She coos at me when I talk to her. She responds to my speech by looking at me initially, and then she babbles in a single consonant sound. So she did kind of a nah sound. And then she's also showing interest in my speech. And so that's some, really, like, she's like 1 month old in this video, but you can still at least document that and show that she's on track for language in general. I don't know if that nah was an English nah or a Salish nah, but she's on track as far as her language at that age. So I'm going to show you another video. This is my daughter. She's 11 and a half months in this video, this next video I'm about to show you. So go ahead and mute your phone.
Huma. Huma.
So far, so good. It's been a little bit glitchy, but not. Hopefully, you guys are able to hear it and see it. So just to look at where she was at as far as speech, she's using some words and word-like sounds. So what I said to her was huma, which means excuse me, and she repeated the word. Now, I couldn't tell, I highly doubt that there's like comprehension, that she knows what that means, but she is saying the word and parroting it back to me, and she's been engaging in that conversation by repeating something that I said, so she's responding to what I'm saying, and then she's also looking at me when I'm talking. Oh, okay. So here we go into a 1 to 2 year old child. So comprehension and receptive. Following simple requests. These are usually the one step requests. Throwing trash in bin when asked. Identifies familiar people, animals, objects when prompted. Speech and expressive. They name familiar people, their family, animals, things that are in their everyday lives like cups and books. They use word and word-like sounds understood by most familiar people, make simple statements about recent events and familiar people and objects that are not present. So that's one thing to think about too, just in general, is that children who are in more preschool, kindergarten age, they tend to talk about things that are present in their environment, and so talking about things that are not present is also a milestone. So something to think about, that if you are wanting to expose them to more language, you want to put more things that they can talk about in their environment. And so where they're at 1 to 2 year olds, they're kind of starting to talk about things that are not in their environment. And they typically use 1 or 2 word sentences. So they'll say juice to indicate I want some juice, daddy go when dad leaves the house or drops them off at daycare. And then engages in conversations. Now they're starting to initiate the conversation, and they'll stay in it briefly. They point to and say words of something and then look at an adult to see if they respond to them. They use appropriate eye contact. They'll pause and wait for a response from the other person. And then they make simple verbal prompts when communicating. So I have another example. So go ahead and unmute your computer. Okay, so looking at that video, here's some things that I was able to catch, and this is all in English. Typically, if children are on par with developmentally as far as like what they're able to do, they should be on par like in both. It kind of breaks, in the end, it breaks down to a matter of vocabulary and how much language they're using. But what I was able to catch in this video is that she does name familiar people, animals, or objects. So she identified Mickey Mouse. She uses one or two word sentences. So she said mouse, uh-oh, Mickey Mouse. I also just now caught that she said inside during the song. And then she uses words and word-like sounds understood by most familiar people. So I understood that she was saying mice when she was saying must. And I also understand that mama meant Mickey Mouse. So somebody who's not familiar with her might not understand that, but she is where she is at development, where she needs to be developmentally. She initiates and intends to brief conversation. She points at the TV saying mama. She looks at me. She turns back to the TV. The video was a little bit, or me recording her was a little bit distracting, but for her, but that is an example of how you can, what you can pull out and kind of what that looks like at that age. So since we're into the 1 to 2 year old age range, I'll go back to that video I was just showing because I want to show you an example of how you can also document this and keep a running record. So unmute your computer.
Aking pupas.
Babas.
Pupas.
No, babas.
Pupas.
Babas.
Aking pupas. Aking pupas.
Look, babas.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to share my screen with you. All right, so hopefully right now you should be looking at a OneNote document that is popped up. And so as you can see in here, I have the video MP4 embedded into the OneNote. Through Adobe, I couldn't play it from here, so I had to upload it separately, but you can, if you upload a video in here, it does save with this little audio file looking thing, but you can open it up and look at it. So this is the observation log. She's 2 years old. This is September of 2017. So here's some of my notes that I gathered from watching this video. She comprehends language. So when asked, King Pupas, where is the kitty? She opened up the DVD case and said Pupas, which means kitty. And then later she pointed to the picture of the cat while saying Pupas. She follows directions, so she did respond to simple verbal requests accompanied by my tone of voice. And so when I was asking, she opened the case to show me the cat after I asked. She's using an expanding expressive vocabulary. She uses the word pupas to identify the cat. She speaks clearly. I'm pretty sure everybody could say that she sounded almost exactly like how I sounded, but in a baby voice. She used her one word. Well, she did mix it. So she said, "Look, pupas." So that's where I was talking about earlier, that their developmentally will be the same, but it depends on how much language they use. So she used a 2-word sentence, but she used both languages. So if she were to say "Advent pupas," look, kitty, and all in Salish, you would note that, versus here, she'd use English to say look, and then she identified what it was in the language. And so engagement and conversation, I did note that the camera was distracting, so she would look at herself in the camera instead of looking at me. If I was not recording, she would have looked at me instead of getting distracted by the camera. And then, so on the right-hand side here, you can always add more pages. So if you want to add maybe so up on the top here, I just have Samarta assessment. And so you can have all your kids, have their own little tab and have their own, this day we did this, this was the observation. You can also keep track of their vocabulary, like an inventory. So based off of that observation, not only did I assess kind of where she's at developmentally, I decided, oh, okay, so this is what I got as far as she comprehends pupas and she can say pupas. I could probably also say that she, I gotta switch my font here, that she can comprehend cane, but I could also say that that might be debatable. Maybe just hearing the word pupas makes her want to open up the DVD. So that's where things do tend to get a little bit murky sometimes. All right, so there's an example on how to document some of the observations you have. So we move into the 2 to 3 year old age range. They also identify familiar objects, touching, pointing, looking, moving towards. Now they're able to follow directions that are more than one step, so you can be like, okay, it's time to wash your hands, then brush your teeth. And they should be able to do that. Before then, they kind of can only focus on one thing at a time. Speech and expressive, again, they're naming familiar people, objects. Now they're using 3 to 4 word sentences, and they may omit some words or use some words incorrectly. They tell simple stories about objects, events, and people that are not present. So now they're starting to get into more, now they're not just talking about things that are not present. Now they're can talk more about like stories, simple stories, maybe that happened with their families, over the weekend or last evening, but they're starting to get talk more about what's not in their environment. And again, engaging in conversation, they do attend to brief conversations and uses that appropriate eye contact and pauses. So these just kind of build off of each other. They're still kind of here. They might, I know at some point in this PowerPoint I have listed out the number of exchanges that they typically will have. Let's see. Okay, so that was 2 to 3. So I didn't have any videos for that one, but I do have, I believe, at least one more video for the next age range, possibly. 3 to 5 years old, now they're starting to follow directions of 2 or more steps but they do relate to familiar objects and experiences. So if it's like new instructions of something that they've never done before, then they probably are unable to do that. Responds appropriately to specific vocabulary, simple statements, questions, and stories. And so now their comprehension, so this example, they're listening to a friend talk about a cut finger. They go to the dramatic play area for a Band-Aid. So it's getting a little bit more complex. Their speech and expressive, they can describe and tell the use of familiar items. They're understood by most people. They may mispronounce things that are new or long. They use complete 4 to 6 word sentences. They tell stories about another time or place, and this time now they're starting to contain logical order, and then it's getting a lot more detailed than what they were able to do before. Engages in conversation. So now they're engaging in at least 3 exchanges, and then they stay on topic. So sometimes younger kids, you'll start talking about one thing and then they'll just go off on a whole nother thing. So this time they're able to keep up with what you're talking about. They maintain the conversation, so they ask additional questions. They ask for clarification. And then they're starting to use more acceptable rules of social engagement. So now they're pausing and they're not interrupting as much. And then they're not screaming it. Maybe, well, they could be. I think a lot of us have worked with children, so but they're better able at regulating the volume of their voice. So here's another example. So go ahead and unmute your computer, and I'm going to mute my phone.
I just said that I'm going.
Say it again.
I never heard it.
What'd you say?
Jimmy Soup. Hola.
Hola.
Okay, and so let's see, I'm waiting for my thing to pop up here. Okay, so here's an example, and this is in English, but I just thought it was, I just thought it was funny. So she's talking about her brother. She used that same hole thing, and I said, what did you say? And so she said, I just said it at Inquanime. So she's naming her brother, her familiar person. She uses words and word-like sounds and is understood by most familiar people. She may use 3 or 4 word sentences. So, and it could be, some words could be said incorrectly. So I didn't heard him. So there's, 4 words in that sentence. And instead of saying I didn't hear him, she added the D, which lots of kids do in English at that age. Engages in conversation, so she used appropriate eye contact, paused and waited for me to talk, pays attention to speaker. So she is, again, really on par for her language development. Okay, 5 to 6-year-olds, this is where they really kind of explode, I guess, language-wise. So they're starting to respond appropriately to really complex statements, questions, vocabularies, and stories. And then they're able to follow detailed and multi-step instructions and directions. And so then they're starting to use new and less familiar or technical words in everyday conversation. So this is where you start hearing them say words that they think they know what it means, and it may be kind of different than what they're thinking. Even some adults do this. But they're starting to use words that they're not super familiar with. They could still pronounce multi-syllabic or unusual words. They're starting to pronounce those correctly. And so uses long, complex sentences and follows most grammatical rules. And this is kind of after this age, 5 to 6 years old, this is where they really start to talk a lot like I don't like to use the term fluent speaker, but they start to talk using that acceptable grammar. My son, I have 3 sons. I have a 7, 9, and a 10-year-old. And so the other day I heard my 9-year-old tell my 7-year-old, you need to work on your grammar. But he was a little bit speech delayed. Okay, so engages in lengthy, complex conversations of 5 or more exchanges. Extends the conversation by moving gradually from one topic to a related topic. Uses acceptable language and social rules during communication with others. Inside voice, outside voice, etc. Okay, so here's an example of an assessment that you can use, and I geared this assessment towards the 3 to 5-year-old age range. So this is where it can also get a little bit tricky because teaching, for example, in a language nest or school versus a public school will be really different. And so I'm going to try to explain this to where it can kind of cover both. So say you're in a language nest and you have a theme. So maybe your monthly theme is, in this case, a beach or a shore theme. And I'm from Washington State, so I'm using Pacific Northwest interior animals and environment. So this is my theme. These are the vocabulary that I've been targeting. So I've already have my curriculum, and I've already identified this is the words I want them to learn through this unit, whether it's immersion or school. So then I'm going to be assessing them on whether they know this language. And so if it's in a public school, it's going to be fairly simple in that you're really, and I'll come back to this later. It's going to be really simple and more of a class, if you have a language class versus a language school or nest, because you're really just going to be targeting the words itself and not necessarily how they're using it. So for example, I am going to design this picture here. So I have this little frog, turtle, snake, this little image here. And so I've printed out this image, and I'm sitting at a table with a child. I have the printed image of this that you see on the screen in front of the child. And in my hands, I have a piece of paper that has these questions with the little check boxes. So as I'm sitting there with the child, I'm going to ask them, "Akin he arsi," where is the turtle? And so then the child will respond to that. So then, I mean, this is just an example as far as the check boxes. So I put child points to the correct image with ease. So maybe the child just, boom, points to the turtle. Child points to the correct image with considerable effort or some adult prompting. So maybe they have to sit and think about it for a really long time, or maybe you kind of give them a little bit of a hint, or maybe the child points but it's to the wrong image, or even if the child does not make an attempt at all to point out anything. Same thing, Akinisu, where's the water? So you're just asking them questions about the image. So same image, and now I'm going to ask them to follow some simple directions. So this one says, "Kanti skawil, ihyus kant at touch the water and then touch the tree." So then you can kind of have your little check boxes and then mark off which ones that they do. Assessing speaking and expressive. This is more towards immersion programs, children who are in language nest or language schools. I wouldn't really, I'll talk more about that later. Okay, so uses expanding vocabulary. So I would say stimacha, pointing to the fish. So I have a checkbox for child names the word correctly, child names the word but with some help from adult, child incorrectly names the word, child does not make attempt. Stimacha, pointing to the eel, child names the word correctly, needs help, incorrect word, does not make an attempt. This is where it might not be applicable to like a public school class type of situation. Okay, so now we're getting more into can they engage using complete sentences or conversations. So, "Akin kachuihi kutwin," where does the eel live? And so we have check boxes. Maybe the child responded in a full sentence of 3 or more words. Maybe they responded in a full sentence but really needed some help. They gave a 2-word response, gave a 1-word response. Child was unable to give a response. You can also have a note section for what, the child's response was if it doesn't align with any of these. What else do you see here? And so now you're asking the child, this is like a little bit more open, so you're asking them kind of basically just to tell you what they know. And so maybe the child only says, simple words, maybe they respond in sentences, so you can really kind of gauge where they're at there. Okay, I'm just going to skip that one. So then assessing conversation. So this one is if you want to see if they can stay in about 3 exchanges. So this one you could ask the who, what, where, why questions. So for example, I could say, "Why is there a pig at the beach?" And then then they start talking about that. And then you ask, well, what is that? Why would that pig want to do that? Or you just kind of you find something in the image and you kind of try to keep the child talking about it, and you can see how many engagements that they have with that conversation. Or if it's just really quick or they shrug their shoulders, and you can note what their responses were to that. So as I mentioned earlier, the children, as far as like developmentally, like for instance, a child will be able to make up 3 to 4 word sentences. That's where they'll be developmentally in each language, but what varies is like the amount of their vocabulary. And so as far as gauging whether or not, so they can be developmentally still, language in general, they'll be on par, but they might not have the vocabulary to match where they're at developmentally. And so that's where I would recommend trying to track their vocabulary. So if you're in a language nest and you have different areas, so maybe you have an art area, somewhere to eat, a dramatic play area, a rest area, you could hang up these checklists. I would recommend having checklists for your classroom and then like laminating them. That way you can continuously write on them, or having a whole nother checklist for your themes, and you can rotate those. But in this example, this is a checklist for the dramatic play area. And so I have listed here all the items that are in my dramatic play area: sheet, stove, sink, cabinet, plate, etc. So as we're going throughout our day, as we're doing our daily routine, day-to-day thing, the kids are playing in the dramatic play area. And I'm just kind of observing. I'm talking with them. They're talking with other kids. But as I notice they start to say things, I'll write their name down and I'll date it. Or as I notice that they're starting to understand what I'm talking about, I'll write their name down and I'll date it. So maybe I ask little Bobby, can you grab me a plate? And he goes and he does grab me a plate. I can write down his name on that and then write down the date that he was able to demonstrate to me that he knew what that was. Now, can he say plate yet? Maybe not. But until I hear him say it, then I can write, his name down. And then the receptive and the expressive, whether they can comprehend it or whether they can say it, those are going to be, they're going to understand it a lot longer, or a lot sooner before they can say it. So, you'll have, little Bobby, he might be somewhere down the line, he'll be able to say plate, but probably not that day. Okay. You can also just do recorded interviews. So when I was an immersion school teacher, there would be no way for me at the time, in my particular situation, if somebody said hey, we need to know where your students are at in the language, can you tell us where you think they're at, and give us some evidence to where you think they're at. This is what I would do. I would sit down with them. I would have a list of conversation starters, and I would record our conversation, and then I would pull out, like I showed you before, not just the where they're at developmentally engages in conversation and all of that, but I would also mark down this is their expressive vocabulary, this is their receptive vocabulary based off of this conversation that I had. So anecdotal notes, I would also take these. So I just kind of would keep little evidence of, because when I was an immersion school teacher, we were not required as teachers at that time to assess them. That just wasn't part of our grant that we had, at least not to my knowledge. I didn't have to assess them. But I always kept records, because if anybody ever came to me and said, hey, where are your kids at as far as language, I wanted to be able to say, this is where they're at, and here's my evidence as to where they're at. So I would just take either anecdotal notes, or I'd do video recordings all the time. But here's an example of an anecdotal note. So this is an example of my son. So I just thought that this was another little funny situation. So we're in the car, and I'm at a stoplight, and I'm getting, so then the stoplight turns green. Well, I'm behind another car, and so I'm telling the car in front of me, "Hui, hui," which means go, because I'm not particularly patient when I'm driving in the city. And so then the car in front of me starts to move. And so my son, he's 4 years old at this time, and he says, you say "hui," and that car "hui." So you said go, and that car went. And I said, "Kuk ikniam," and which means yes. He listened to me, or it listened to me. And he said, yeah, that car can hear you. And I said, "Hakuk ikniamint," which means, do you listen to me, or did you listen to me? And his response was, I'm not a car. So this is what I got out of that conversation. So that he comprehends the word hoy, and he can say that was the one word that he said, although I would argue that he could probably say more than that. But for these notes, this is what he said. And so he hears me make a statement. So I know he understands because he hears me say hoy, he sees the card hoy, and then he makes a comment about it. So then, after he says that, I said, yes, it listens to me. And so I know that he comprehends that because then he responds saying, yeah, that car can hear you. So what was interesting, I thought about this, kikania means listen in our language, but he doesn't know the English translation, so he translated it into hear. So listen and hear to him are very similar concepts, and so he said the word hear. He understood that I was asking questions. In our language, we don't have the intonation thing a lot, so ha marks a yes or no question. And then the ku, so ha ku kikania means me, that's the me in that sentence. And so then he understood that I was saying do, and then at the end means you. So he understood that I was asking, do you listen to me? Because based off of his response, well, I'm not a car, so I don't listen, or I didn't listen to you because I'm not a car. So why would I hoy? So anyways, I'm able to, kind of take down some notes as far as his comprehension of these words and then his production of the one word. So I also have a note that says, for other observations, so he can maintain and follow simple conversation, but he stays primarily in English. I think he could produce simple sentences like lut hin to kikania, I don't listen, if I prompted him further. I did not prompt him. I did not, try to get more language out of him. He responds appropriately to specific vocabulary and simple statements, questions, and stories. He initiated the conversation and stayed on topic with 4 exchanges. Okay, so I got 13 minutes left. I'm going to try to give you guys some time to answer questions. Okay, so expressive vocabulary by age. Children typically do not speak their first word until about 12 months of age. So then once they hit 18 months, they typically use around 50 in their first language. So I'll show you that here in a second. I'll compare it. 24 months, they use about 200 to 300 words. 3 years old, they can use 500 to 1,000 words. And 5 to 7 years old, they use 3,000 to 5,000 words, approximately. Okay, so I have this, I will share this out, with everybody. Hopefully we have everybody's email address. If not, it will be posted on our, web portal, after this. But this is a document that I have made that kind of shows where children will be at based off of their age and their vocabulary size depending on where they're at. Now, this is a guide because every language is going to be different. And so just take that into consideration that this is not, this is not if they don't make this amount of words, it has some leeway. Okay, so for a 1.5-year-old to a 2-year-old, they can be considered basic if they're on par with their language development, and they can say, this is expressive, all expressive, by the way, and they can say 10 to 20 words. If they're that age and they're on par with their development, and they say 20 to 30 words, then they can be considered intermediate. If they are 18 months old to 2 years old and they say 50 plus words, they can be considered an advanced speaker for that age. And they're on par with their language development. 2 years old basic is 50 to 60, intermediate 60 to 200, advanced 200 to 300. That's a lot of words for a 2-year-old. 3 to 4 years old basic 125 to 150, intermediate 150 to 500, advanced 500 to 1,000. And then 5 to 7 years old basic can be considered anywhere from 750 to 800 words. intermediate 800 to 3,000, advanced 3,000 plus. So as they get older, it's going to be way more difficult to kind of document or track their inventory. But at least with the younger kids, maybe up to 2 to 3 years old, you have a fighting chance at documenting their inventory, their vocabulary inventory, and being kind of accurate in your assessment. So there's also some variation. So here's an example. There's studies that show that children who come from professional families at the age of 4, know about 1,100 words. Children from working class families, they know about 700 words. Children from welfare families, they know about 500 words. But what I wanted to show you is there's a big difference between 500 and 1,000, but that would all be considered advanced. This big gap here. And so there's going to be such a huge variation, and so that's why this is really difficult to assess where they're at, because a developmentally appropriate vocabulary is a very large difference between the low end and the high end. So, but yeah, as you can see, a child who knows 500 words at the age of 4 and a child that knows 1,100 words at the age of 4, they would still be considered an advanced. I put advanced on here. I mean, you can title it whatever you want. It could be first language or fluent or however you want to write that. Okay, so here's my recommendations. For children, assessments are best done one-on-one. I would also say that for immersion nests and schools I would rely on video documentation with the notes, how I showed you in the OneNote. Just keep a documentation on that. And if anybody ever comes back and asks, you can say, this is my justification. You can also, if you're working on units and lessons and you're also tracking other things, you can do the picture card assessment, like the beach example I gave, or you can do a recorded interview. As far as language classes, I would just really stick with pre-made images or realia that are scripted with pre-made check marks. In a public school type of setting, it's really hard. You're going to be really hard pressed to get them beyond a basic level anyways. So a lot of it is just going to be words and really simple sentences. And so if they can understand them and if they can say them, it's a lot more black and white than an immersion type of setting. Okay. So another tip, many children in immersion or language classes will by default respond in English. So you want to make sure that they're not just being lazy. So if a child responds in English, you can ask them to say it in the language, or you can ask them what in your own language and pretend like you don't understand the English. I did that a lot, especially when I knew the kids knew. So they would say, they would ask for water in English, and I would say, "Stem," and they'd say, I want a cup of water. I'd say, "Stem, I want a cup of water." "Stem," and then they'd finally say, "En gemik te zios," and I'd say, go ahead, go get a drink of water. And so sometimes you really have to not let them be lazy, just to make sure that your assessments are accurate, because they will want to use whatever's easiest. And make sure that when you're assessing them, you want to be sensitive of their little self-esteem, and so make sure to praise their effort and not their answers, and avoid stating if their answers are correct or incorrect. You're assessing. Oh, Terry, let me address your question. I'm guessing you're talking about this slide as far as the variation example. Yes, that is an example of first language. So if you have a child whose first language is English, these are studies done from American families, and so these were the results that came about from English-speaking families in the U.S. And so but it still falls under. So if you're working with a 4-year-old, their vocabulary might be, if they're doing if they're at a basic level, it's not going to be 500 at the minimum. It'll be 125 to 150 or somewhere around here. If they're emerging, they'll have a hopefully that answered your question. Oh, so I also have on here, we'll share out this PowerPoint. So here's just a list of conversation starters if you want an example of ways to start a conversation to record it to assess later. I feel like I also had other things on here. Maybe that was it. Okay, so that is all. And I have 5 minutes left. And does anybody else have any questions?
Okay, so I can either unmute everybody and or you can raise your hand at the top of the bar. There is an icon with a person with their hand up, and you can raise your hand, and we can unmute each individual line as you raise your hand. Or let's see, let me go ahead and unmute everybody's line. Okay, so the lines have been unmuted. So if anybody has a question, we do have about 4 minutes left, and I'm going to put up the information for the survey while we're here on the question piece. So anybody, no questions? Okay.
I also wanted to mention that I have a PDF of all the objectives for development and learning specifically for language. And I'm going to upload that on the web portal. So all the stuff that I shared today about, the engages in conversation and the development part of it, we will post that by the end of today on our web portal.
I wouldn't say by the end of today. Probably by tomorrow or Monday at the very latest. So
I do have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, the hands disappeared on me before I could raise my hand. But I'm curious, in developing a grant for language, do you suggest that we use a baseline and then do those one-on-one assessments to determine, basically, I guess it would be the applicability of the information, right, or the applicability of the assessment and their language growth. So I'm wondering if, so developing the goals and objectives for a grant for language, what do you recommend they do or we do for evaluation for ANA in progress?
A lot of this is just so much situational as far as what your project is about and what your goals are and what your baseline is. So if you have like a baseline of like have zero language experience, a good goal by the end of a grant could be, basic to low intermediate. And I mean, it's so depending. Do you want to share a little bit about your situation and what you're thinking?
Well, we're thinking of, doing this in the school setting, and some have had some language classes already. And yet we know that part of the grant challenge would be to develop that baseline so we can show improvement, right?
Okay.
And then employ specific tactics, of course, to improve them. But that's where, do you shoot for the moon? Or do you say each student, depending on where they start, they're going to increase by X% by the end of the grant?
Right. So I would, in that case, if you're in a public school, I would avoid proficiency, like basic, intermediate. I would not use those terms. I would use it in terms of increase by X amount of vocabulary, or increase by, I would do it all on vocabulary.
Okay.
So if you assess them, if you were to assess them and you find out that, their total vocabulary is, say, less than 50 or 50 to 100, by the end of, also depending on how much time you spend in their classrooms, depending on how much time when you start to finish, is it the full 3 years for 4 hours a week, you're going to want to gauge it kind of based off of that.